So I'm jumping in. I'm jumping in to introduce Sara Rafael Garcia, so that we can have her do her presentation. We might be running a little bit over the time, and so feel free, if you must leave at 4, feel free to just simply leave if you must go. And let me go ahead and start with her presentation, her introduction. So Sara Rafael Garcia is a founder of Writers and Libro Móvil, and she also worked with research coordinator Cecilia Lopez in undergraduate university at California, Berkeley. The title of her project is Modesta Avila, Obstructing Development Since 1889. And she created a hashtag MAOD 1889 is defined as a Modesta Avila Obstructing the Development Since 1889 multimedia digital arts project. Modesta Avila is considered to be a folk heroine of Mexican and Mexican American folks. There are various versions of Modesta Avila's life and the various actions she took in the late 1880s to keep the Santa Fe Railroad from developing on her family's land, which was located in the same region of what is now the San Juan Capistrano train station. The project will trace and focus on Modesta Avila's life via a virtual timeline, a research contribution to the recovery program via the Omeka side, and augmented reality. And so I'll let Sarah take it from here because she does a better job at doing this. And I mean, I'll let her amaze you guys too. Dale, Sara.
Thank you, Gabby. So there's going to be probably a lot of background noise because they're somehow decided to do roofing today on the gallery, and it was unexpected. So if you hear noise, I'm fine. It's just people on the roof. I wanted to start by saying I feel like this was ages ago when I started this project, but it really hasn't been, and I'm not done. So the other thing is that it's just a work. It's going to be constantly a work in progress. As usual, I have big ideas and usually not enough time. So that's the first lesson learned, right? Is this is a passion project of mine for sure, because often in Orange County, and if you all don't know where Santana is, and where, you probably have heard of Orange County because of Disneyland and the Real Housewives of OC, but there's, the Santana is the heart of it, and Santana is 80% Latinx community with a large unaccounted, undocumented folks. And at the same time, in Orange County, people of color make up 60% of the demographics, but this is never talked about. And then with that, align with that, the history of people of color and the history especially of women of color is definitely not at all something that is focused locally. And Modesta, surfaced into our history in the late 1800s, 1889, and no one really started talking about her till the last decade. And it's only because certain folks were doing history on the region, and at first was one particular white journalist who did it, and then eventually Gustavo Adriano started sharing it with the local Latinx community, and as well as Gabriel Sandroman, who's a local journalist, both historians. But what I found interesting as I kept reading about her, and when I really dove deep into her history for my previous project, Santana's Fairy Tales, is that no woman of color had covered her history. And if it wasn't a journalist, it was a scholar who was writing about it. And for me, although I don't necessarily consider myself a scholar, I consider myself a community educator first. I also feel like there's harm as going in as a scholar into a community to do research, because that alone creates another agenda, right? So it's whether an agenda to get published, to become a tenure track, or be accepted in tenure track positions, or to receive tenure positions. Whereas just doing it for the sake of preserving history for that particular person, right? And for that particular community. And so that has always been my focus as a community educator, and even as a professor at a university, is how to do research by prioritizing the person you're researching or the community you're researching, as well as the community who needs to learn about this research and history, right? which is hard to do because you have to make it engaging and then also be accessible in multiple languages, and not just when I'm not just speaking of English and Spanish, but also like of changing the language for community-based education versus academic. So originally the project has this large scope, and I chuckled when Gavi said augmented reality because I'm like, yes, I'm still working on that. But the beautiful journey was that I did get to work with a young, scholar, and young, I mean 18, 19 now, who is a new student at Berkeley, or, born and raised in Santana. I've known her family for several years, but when she was, seeking employment, she was like, I just need to get a job, somewhere at a fast food place. I'm like, well, you have these amazing skills. You really should reach for a higher potential. And she's a photographer by trade. And so working with Cecilia, I think, was the most empowering part of this project, but she's not my only collaborator. I also worked with Carla Zarate, who's a local Mexican artist in Santana, and a transmedia artist in Houston, who I actually met during my time during a fellowship in Houston, Rima. And Rima is Syrian American who's been working on augmented reality platforms. So collaborating us together towards this project. The first part of the project was collecting the data. And I thought I knew Modesta's story before, but I really had no idea how much information was out there. I do have to give props to Professor Dr. Lisbeth Haas, who's out in oh my gosh, Santa Cruz, I believe. I probably got that wrong. It's either Santa Cruz or Davis. But she has covered Modesta profusely and thoroughly. But there was still so much more ground to cover. There's another gentleman out here in Orange County who is really a lawyer by trade, who claims to have the full narrative of Modesta, but he always counters her narrative, saying she's not the heroine everybody's made her out to be, that she, And so for me, that was the biggest thing, was like, I want to counter the local man who's claiming, the local white man who's claiming to know Modesta's life, and using it to his advantage to distort her icon with the local community, right? So I'm going to show you something that, just so that you can get to know Modesta too. And then I'm going to show you the highlight of the project and then work backwards. Because I think sometimes if we start at the beginning where I'm digging for files, you're going to get lost like I did, and we're not going to have enough time. But if I start with the highlight, the one of the end products, right, and then go backwards, then maybe you'll have some more questions like, how did you get there? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. So I was very fortunate to be living in Sacramento for the last year, which is a beautiful part of California that I love now. But because I was in Sacramento, I qualified to submit my work for consideration, what is called, let's see, it was Sacramento State, but it was at the Center on Race and Immigration and Social Justice. This was actually an inquiry that was sent to me by Josie Talamantes, who is here in the audience, and they have ties to both ends of California, like I do, and because I thought this is such a great opportunity to showcase the work. They were looking for preserving POC history, for social justice, and I thought, oh, okay, I can submit something. What was I going to submit? I had no idea. I knew that I had the description of the project and I had started working towards the archives, but then I thought, can we put the archives into a virtual timeline quickly? Luckily, because I was working with Ceci, it was a great opportunity to teach her how to do a virtual timeline. I learned from Gavi, so it's three generations, not necessarily because I think Gavi and I are the same generation, but as far as tiers of mentorship, of learning how to do virtual timelines. So, they had to send a sample of what our work might look like. It doesn't have to be finished. And I sent a snippet of a timeline. And then they created it as a virtual exhibition. along with everybody else that got accepted. The beautiful part, and I have to echo this, the beautiful part about this conference, virtual exhibition, is they paid everyone a stipend starting at $400. They were blown away with the virtual aspects and digital humanities of our timeline, so they offered Ceci and I $500 each. And so I think that's one of the things that we ourselves are the first ones to devalue our work. One, because we're so in it that we don't realize how much information we can put out with the tools that we already have. And a lot of people are not familiar yet with virtual timelines or virtual platforms to preserve and represent history. So I think the virtual timeline was something that I advise everybody to learn how to do, because if you can use Google Docs, you can create a virtual timeline. And I was very fortunate to learn from Gabi and then pass on this tool, not only to Cecilia, but also I was teaching at Chapman University at the time, and all my students there for 3 semesters learned how to do virtual timelines. So what they covered here was they obviously listed our the project description, which you heard from Gabi, and our bios and our pictures. But one of the great opportunities from this project is they had like a call and response with academics. So this particular person got, his name is Jose Artiga, who's part of the Share Foundation, he got to view the virtual timeline and write a response piece. And talking about accessibility, he wrote it in Spanish, and then it was translated to English. And he connected it with his work that he was doing in Latin America, and talking about how eminent domain plays a huge role in taking lands from people, right? And Modesta Avila's work is about that, is holding, her, literally standing her ground to keep her parents' house near the San Juan Capistrano train station. But I also want to show you the timeline, because this is the current working product that we have. And I'm going to go through it in each part, because all the technology that was involved was DIY, so do it yourself. So I literally cut and pasted sounds. The sounds of chickens that you're going to hear came from YouTube. Train came from YouTube recordings. The imagery came from Carla Zarate and her sister Patricia, who created a new image for Modesta. And part of that was, my objective was to change her image, because the only image at the moment when you Google Modesta is her mugshot from being convicted. And I think, again, it's not just about presenting that history, how she was the first felon out of Orange County for obstructing development, but also humanizing her as a Mexican woman, Mexican-American young woman that was during these times where women, not only women, but Mexicans, were not seen as people that could hold space or have a place in this society, right? So we're talking about the late 1800s. So I'll let her introduce you to her.
Mi nombre es Modesta Avila. Soy de San Juan Capistrano, California.
So that is her first introduction, and to me that was really important for it to be at the beginning of the timeline, so that people do not see the mugshot first, right? And so this first page on the timeline gives you the hashtag, gives you general information about the project and going forward, right? And summarizes what I just said in a lot of words. The next part goes into the archive work. And again, for me, it was more important to reestablish that there is no one way to tell history. So, so much of it has been told by white men and court documents, especially in Modesta's life. So I wanted to start with what's on paper, and then I wrote, híjole, this country is always about what's on paper. So I'll tell you what we, our first glance at archives with, Cecilia did a lot of the digging, what we were able to pull away from, and then go into a little bit more of Modesta's life. So the establishment of Orange County, was in 1889. And so with that came the railroad as well. And what a lot of folks saw in Southern California was land being taken away for eminent domain, through the use of eminent domain, right? Still happens today in Santa Ana, maybe not in so many words, but it's called redevelopment, or like when they do affordable housing and stuff like that. Those are all new ways to take land from the community for different agendas. So this is Modesta's house in its current, in its current place, which is now a coffee house. And so it's known as Hummingbird House Cafe. You can definitely go have a cup of coffee in Modesta's house. You can see how close it is to the train station, to the train tracks, and get a better understanding, right? One of the other things is that we realized in her story is that there was a lot of mistelling. When the document, and this is something that is not talked about and through the research that is commonly known, but even because of the times that these court hearings were happening, language played a huge role. So Modesta was said to know English, but still not enough, and they never provided an interpreter in the court. And then when they interviewed her family, they didn't interview them publicly, and so they documented that even her relatives were against her protest, but that was never a public interview. And these are things, again, that no one really talks about, is how what is documented is even not necessarily true, because it was done in such a way that the story could be told to favor the court, right? Or to favor the folks who wanted the land. So I do wonder what actually happened during those interviews. So this is the train station from 1895, less than 10 years after, I guess it was like 6 years after her protest. But it was 15 feet away from her home. This is just an image that I was able to get from Wikipedia. This is her famous quote. So this is something that she said repeatedly when she was protesting. This land belongs to me, and if the railroad wants to run here, they will have to pay me $10,000. And I know $10,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but it was in 1889. And this is the famous mugshot, right? That was taken at the federal government. And not only was she the first felon out of Orange County, she was the first woman admitted into San Quentin. And supposedly she was admitted pregnant, because there was rumors that she was pregnant, and she was pregnant out of wedlock, so that alone caused more issues. And that's also again, very familiar to like the femme fatale, the history of women, right? Because the first time they took her to court, it was a 6-6 hung vote. So that tells you there was enough for people not to believe everything that they were saying, right? But then they literally made her out to be this, promiscuous Mexican woman who was pregnant out of wedlock. And so that changed people's view, right? And so when they took her back to court, she had a different persona. And of course, that changed to a guilty verdict in the end. She was sentenced to 3 years at San Quentin, but she never came out because she died there. And supposedly, I believe she died of pneumonia. So this leaves me to how I'm presenting the history, right? And so this is another video that took multiple forms of documentation. The image that you see behind Modesta in this picture is actually a picture that I took because I went to document the site. And now there's a historic district that's right behind the train station that actually has Modesta Avila acknowledged, but the picture they have of her is her mugshot. And so part of it, again, is like, how do we retell these stories? And like I say here, is that they say the real stories come from nosotros, la gente. So I'll let you listen to Modesta.
Hola, mi nombre es Modesta Avila. Soy de San Juan Capistrano, California. Behind me, you see the San Juan Capistrano train station. I am standing on its railroad tracks. I am here to tell you a story about me. It is important you recognize that I am the one telling it. I have yet to share it with anyone else. In 1889, I performed an act of protest against the Santa Fe Railroad. The railroad tracks laid 15 feet away from my doorstep, mi casa, mi hogar, sobre mi tierra. Due to the many complications and disruptions the railroad caused, I demanded that I receive proper compensation for my land. This demand took place in the act of obstructing the railroad tracks by laying a laundry line post across the rail. Con mi ropa sucia, I hung my dirty laundry with a note, porque sabía que estaba bien enojada, so they would know I was 100% against them developing on my land. Even my chickens were upset. Can you hear them? The note said, "This land belongs to me, and if the railroad wants to run here, they will have to pay me $10,000. Yes, millones de dólares. This is my land. This is my story."
So one of my favorite parts of that is that Gloria Estrada is a good friend of mine and amazing musician and of all kinds. Used to play with La Santa Cecilia, now she's Viento Callejero. Anyways, I texted her and I said, "Hey, you know my Modesta project?" She's like, yeah, you finally need music. And she was so excited. I was like, I do, I need a corrido. And she's like, and she sends me something via my phone, literally that same beat. And I start plugging it in and I sent her this video and she's like, wait, that was just for me to play around with. I didn't know you were using that beat. And I was like, it worked, it's perfect. And then she was just so excited and wanted to redo it, but I was like, no, that's it. 4 seconds is all I need. So again, it was also like a collaborative of folks of different backgrounds that were behind this in different ways, and mainly because they believe in this, to retell the story, right? The reason of changing the appearance of and the stories of Modesta to tell the right story. But again, which one is the right story? I don't know, because there's so many. One is called the Dama Blanca, the white lady, and you can Google Modesta and it comes up even in Wikipedia, or the lady in white, right? Or the roofers. So when I went to visit the historic district, there was a transient person camping out near Modesta's image, and she saw that I kept taking pictures of Modesta, and she said, "Hey, do you know the story of this lady?" And I thought, well, here's a great opportunity to hear a different story, right? And I said, yeah, kind of. What story do you know? And she starts telling me. She says, oh, they built a railroad right next to her house, and she had chickens. She's like, and her chickens stopped laying eggs So they were, they were really disrupted by the constant sound of the train, and she couldn't make a living. She couldn't have, eggs for her household. So she got really obsessed by that and became, kind of frantic like her chickens. And they say she was really against the railroad for that. She's like, and all she was trying to do is like keep her land. And I found it even more interesting that story was being told to me by a transient woman who was camping literally less than 10 feet away from Modesta's house and the railroad, right? So that was just one story, right? And that's why the chickens even have a play in this story. And so here's another image, how we're altering Modesta to be more of herself rather than a convicted felon. And so that was Carla using her shadow and videotaping herself as Modesta. So, and then just to tell a little bit about the project. So originally started with Twitter, and if I'll switch over. Let me know if you can't see this. Can you see the Twitter page? Okay. So we started with Twitter to start creating documentation. So between Cecilia and I started taking documentation of the current region. The goal is to eventually have a graphic novel where all the documentation is in black and white or grayscale, and then that it's only Modesta in color. Again, to make her the focal point and offer a counter narrative to her image of being a convicted felon. So we started it here. We haven't really kept it up too much because we all got kind of too busy during the pandemic. But it's kind of telling behind the scenes. But the way it's told is through Modesta's voice, which is unfortunately my voice too. But I encourage my collaborators to take part in it, but they're kind of shy. They're all behind the scenes artists. But showing different images that talk about the region. Here's an image of the AR so that you can see.
Mi nombre es Modesta Avila. Soy de San Juan, Capistrano, California.
That's Rima on the screen.
Mi nombre es Modesta Avila.
So the goal is to, when the book or when the story gets published, or even when it gets placed on a virtual platform, that people will be able to use their phones and click on the image and hear her talk. So it's not just the virtual timeline, it's any time that she's featured. And then I'm going to stop sharing for a moment just to see if there's any questions or anything in the chat. Or is there any questions now before I go and show you how the archival stuff worked?
Yeah, I think we have about 5 more minutes. Yeah. This is amazing. Oh, it still gives me goosebumps every time I see this stuff, Sarah. It's just so empowering.
I'll share the screen and to give folks an idea of what it looks like behind the scenes to collect all this data, and not necessarily spend time on it, but I can definitely answer questions. Because if we want to talk about what did I learn and what advice I can give, is to have time. It's such a precious project that all of you proposed, to really make time for it. I know it's hard because we all have lives and sometimes they get derailed, and no pun intended, but the truth is these projects are really important to our communities. They don't even know how important they are because some of them don't even know this information exists. But every time I share the timeline with someone, they are just in complete awe. And the timeline is only like 1/100th of the information that we gathered. And so these are all our drives right now of information that we gathered. And we're one step away from putting stuff up on Omeka, but I have to go through everything, and so I have to make time to do that. And I'll take questions.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, so Lilia has her hand raised. Dale, Lilia.
It's just it's good to see you, Sara. It's been a minute, Sara's comadre, and just so much appreciation for not only decentering but decolonizing our ways of knowing, right? And so much of these conversations become so insulated in our silos, especially when we're caught up in the remolino of the academic industrial complex, right? And so I appreciate the way in which you're vocalizing that there needs to be an accessibility and intention of how we understand these historias. You know, for those of us who've been doing this work, we've known about Modesta, but then what gets left out is everyone else who doesn't, right? And I know earlier today there was a conversation about what was going on with critical race theory, and I know we have to cope right now in Texas in terms of what that means, but for me, it absolutely devastates me because I already know. I mean, we can say they don't know anything anyway when they get here, but they're really not going to know anything, and that breaks my heart, you know. And so I'm sorry to get emotional about it. So I don't joke about it. It is serious. It is serious that from K to 12, there will be a complete erasure of all this kind of work we're doing. So I'll leave it there.
And I think that, you know, goes to say that that's why it can't only exist in the Ivory Towers. There has to be a way for us to share it beyond, whether it's a zine, whether it's a virtual timeline, whether it's Arte Publico's website, right? And again, we have to speak in multiple languages. And so I don't mean English, Spanish, and Mandarin. I mean from the community to academia back to the community. Because we, you know, the only way we're going to engage folks who are not engaged is when they see it in their backyard.
Can I pick up on that? I just, Alberto Pulido, I'm working with Josie at Chicano Park. One of the things that really strikes me, and I really thank you for it, is you've given multiple voices, not just one. And sometimes we try to create these polemics when we're writing these narratives about, well, that's their story and here's our story. But the richness of the multiple stories and your openness to gather them is just simply brilliant. And what's one of the challenges with living history, because you have so many different perspectives. So therefore you're struggling on how to really define and tell that story. So you've solved that in so many ways because all of the stories are valid and they need to be addressed. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Roxy? I know, is it Roxy and Camila or just Roxy sin Camila?
Camila's around, but me está dejando en paz un segundo. Okay. No, this was really great. I'm so embarrassed to say I didn't know about Modesta, right? Like it just, but I think even that's telling, right, about the kind of work that still needs to happen. And I guess I guess Camila's book is gonna make an appearance, right? So I have these little feminist books or something. Modesta needs to be on there, right? Like this is the one on activists. And I'm like, what more the badass like woman, right? Like in this one has Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and Malala, right? And you're just like, here's the Latin, right? Like Modesta can be the thing where it's so iconic, right? Like and it's real and it's and tragic, right? Like that I'm like, what, this is perfect material for even just in commodifying or making, you know, but like film, right? Like why don't we have this just a movie about Modesta? Like it just seems like that, those kinds of stories, that the only way that such a badass like isn't more mainstream, it's because it's been deliberately, you know, like held, right? The power of the railroad companies and all these people like actually keeping a story as interesting and as empowering and as real, right? About the fact that she stood up, she did her rebellion, and she paid for it with her life, right? Like the fact of how, so it has all of these markers of like greatness or whatever. And then it was also where she, you know, she was brought down, she was silenced completely, right? The narratives of her mugshot, of all of these things, right, that dominate. So anyway, it was just like, I wanted to say like how interesting this was. I'm so happy that you're doing this project, that I happened to land on it. And I also just need to, I don't know when I'll have more time, you know, to keep learning all the things I don't know, but I'm happy to always come across all these like inspirational figures and, you know, mujeres doing, you know, that did all this amazing work. So I'm so excited about this and see the project grow more, to use it in my classes, you know, because like I'm saying that I didn't know about it, but I also, why wasn't I taught, right? So also making sure that they exigir, right, that this is taught, right, that there needs to be space in these classes, because I've taken classes, right, on feminine, you know, all these things. I'm like, oh, we need that, but no, you know, somebody to mention a figure like Modesta. So in kind of admitting like my own thing, it's also like, why don't I know if I'm kind of in this field, right? Like, you know, that should be more, that should be scaffolded somehow for me, or, you know, introduced somehow, because I definitely have stumbled across, you know, all the canonical people, you know, they make room for all the people that don't need attention, right, in these classes, and no one has made space for Modesta story so far in my educational, you know, journey.
The good thing is that my former book, Santana's Fairy Tales, does mention Modesta lightly, and that's why I started on this research. But it just got admitted as an ethnic studies requirement in the Santa Unified School District in my hometown for 9th graders. So the students will learn about Modesta, and Santa Ana's Fairy Tales has its own website, which is santanasfairytales.com. That shares a little bit of the background. It has an art. The website is its archival work. And this is before I started this project. So the idea was like, how do I prove that these are real stories, even though people want to say they're fiction? And I know that Lilia already teaches it too. So Lilia is very familiar with all of that. But that's one way to engage young adults, like, because Modesta started protesting at 12, but what happened when she was 18? Papers. She became an adult, and that's why they convicted her. It's no different than, oh gosh, I forgot her name and I shouldn't. Claudette Colvin, the young mujer that actually stood up against the bus segregation before Rosa Parks, but nobody paid attention to her because she was a pregnant teenager. So they didn't want that as the face of protest, right? So it's the same thing. Modesta Avila started at 12, and the reason that she got convicted is because she turned 18 and became an adult, and they can go after her through the courts.
We have 2 more questions, Caroline and then Diana, and then I think we'll wrap up so that people can get to their dinners. Or Caroline?
Oh, you're muted.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. It was just such a powerful presentation. I was texting one of my colleagues and collaborators, Erica Ramirez Mayora, because she's doing a podcast on Modesta that I've been working with her on. She said she had already interviewed you, and I wanted to specifically ask you about your decision to animate her in that way. And some of the thought process that went beyond that, because that was just so incredibly powerful. There's been so many times where I've either looked at images of my own ancestors or been looking at archival photos and thought of the ways in which, you know, they just have so much to say. I know they're talking to us, you know. And so how did you go about choosing this particular method to amplify her voice?
It's what I call DIY augmented reality. I really thrive, and because I'm a product before the internet, so I went to undergrad before there was Google, and I tell my students that too, and they freak out. They're like, "You're that old?" I'm like, "I am that young." But so a lot of my trial and error with technology is learning how to do it Rasquacha style, right? Like so that barriers are not like money barriers and technology barriers can be minimized. So I've always wanted to mess around with AR. I just don't have the skills or the technology knowledge or access to some of the programming because it's expensive. So I messed around with apps on my phone. There's a great one that's called Mug Life, and that's probably my favorite one. You can make anybody talk. I was showing my one of my elder friends in Sacramento, Eddie Salas, and he was like, "Can you make my mom talk?" And I took a picture of his mom, and I was like, "What do you want your mom to say?" He's like, "I don't know. What would she say to me?" And so I did it, and he was totally kind of spooked, but also laughed about it. So it's the same platform that Ancestry.com started using to make pictures talk, but you can make a flower talk if you wanted to. The funny part is it just adds random lips and teeth, so then you really freak out because those are my teeth. No, they're not. So I have some really funny like blooper moments with Modesta that will never go on this documentation project, but I do send them to my friends, like Modesta criticizing her teeth. Or Modesta saying, why do I have this weird voice? This is not my voice, you know? So I say play with the free apps. And then once you like an app, that's when you can purchase a little bit, you know, pay $1 or $2 a month to remove their marketing. Sometimes it's a little bit more, but that's what I've been doing. And then one of the other, I started with a comic app, but I really didn't like that because I didn't want to make her a cartoon because they do that to POC so many times. And so I started talking to my artist friend who I've collaborated with before. Carla's the same artist I worked with for Santana's Fairy Tales. I really like her style. And she has full integrity when she does work. She won't do anything unless she's done the research, like the flowers. All the flowers around Modesta are California flowers from this region, right? And so but she's not a facial portrait person, but her sister is. So she collaborated with her sister to create an image of Modesta based on the mugshot, but to humanize her. And so that was the whole reason. It's like, how do we humanize someone that we can't take a new photo of, right? And then do it respectfully. So that was the whole point. And we all know once we see a person talking, we hopefully feel a little bit more empathetic. I made her mugshot talk. First, her mugshot is impossible to make smile. It's really creepy. And two, I still feel haunted rather than like empowered, right? And so I definitely wanted to change her image for everyone else for that reason.
I just want to say that it was very powerful. I mean, because it's so accessible in a sense to show in classrooms, you know, to students, because I teach primarily high school, middle school, high school. And I just find things like that are hit home for a lot of people and a lot of students. On the other hand, it also shows, you know, her story, the oppression on all the levels in terms of, you know, misogyny, you know, women, how women were treated and are still treated, you know, in societies today. And so that's important for me too, to when I research her story, if I'm going to use it for my classroom, to bring those things up as well, because her downfall was not just that she stood up, was because of her gender as well, you know, and, you know, the prevalent sort of thoughts of women at that time were just super horrible. And, you know, her mugshot, yeah, it's stern, it's tough, but I rather think that that's a real sign of defiance as well. So we reivindicamos, we take back certain things that are seen as negative and put them out in the forefront as well, right? And I would hate to see, like, who depends on who makes a film of her story. I hate to see her become, you know, a Salma Hayek or somebody like that, you know, sexualized and fetishized and, you know, having to depend on the guy, you know, or something like that, because it happens all too often, you know, in our histories. Thank you very much for what you do, for all of you, to both presenters.